On a quiet morning, a group of officers at Brookhaven Police Department humiliated a woman they believed was just another civilian, grabbing her, tasering her, and mocking her in front of their peers. But what they didn't know? She was their new chief of police. Now, the question remains, how will she respond to this blatant abuse of power? Will she seek justice, or will corruption fight back harder than ever? Watch until the end to see how power shifts and the ones who once ruled with fear face the consequences of their actions. And don't forget, like, subscribe, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Let's dive in. Fire alarm police car. The town of Brookhaven, Georgia, was still waking up as the sun cast its first light over the quiet streets. Small businesses lined the sidewalks, their neon signs flickering on, while the scent of fresh coffee drifted from a nearby cafe. To an outsider, it seemed like a peaceful southern town. But beneath the surface, Brookhaven carried a darker reputation, one of corruption, racial bias, and unchecked power within its police force. Naomi Carter pulled into a parking spot across from Brookhaven Police Department, shutting off the engine of her black SUV. She wasn't here as an outsider. She was here to take control. Dressed in a sharp navy blazer over a crisp white blouse, she stepped out, her calm but commanding presence instantly setting her apart. She was here as the new chief of police, but she wasn't ready to announce it just yet. Instead of heading straight inside, she walked into a small cafe across the street. Observation was key. She needed to see this department for what it was before stepping into it as its leader. The cafe was mostly empty, except for a table of 3 uniformed officers drinking coffee and laughing. Naomi sat near the window listening. "You hear about the new chief?" one of them said, shaking his head. "Yeah," another scoffed. "Some FBI lady from the city. Black woman too. Bet she's here to fix us. Like we need fixing." The third officer chuckled. "She won't last. We've had reformers before. They come in with big ideas, then realize real policing isn't about playing fair." Naomi sipped her coffee, keeping her expression neutral. She had heard men like this before, officers who thought power made them untouchable. Finishing her drink, she placed a tip on the table and walked out, heading straight for the police station. Her heels clicked against the pavement as she approached the building. "Time to see this mess up close," she muttered under her breath. Brookhaven PD was about to change, whether they were ready for it or not. Naomi pushed open the doors of Brookhaven Police Department, stepping inside with a measured, confident stride. The air inside was thick with the stench of stale coffee, sweat, and the unmistakable scent of unchecked authority. Officers lounged at their desks, some flipping through paperwork without urgency, others chatting as if the station were more of a social club than a place of law enforcement. She approached the front desk, where a young officer barely out of training sat scrolling through his phone. He glanced up at her, blinking as if surprised to see a black woman standing there. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone laced with hesitation. Before Naomi could answer, a sharp voice rang out from across the room. "What the hell do you think you're doing here?" Naomi turned slowly, her eyes meeting Ryan Callaway's, a tall, broad-shouldered officer with a sharp jaw and a permanent smirk that reeked of entitlement. His uniform was pristine, his badge polished to a gleam, as if the shine on it made him more legitimate. "Excuse me," Naomi responded, arching a brow. Callaway walked over, his boots thudding heavily against the floor, stopping just a little too close for comfort. "You look lost," he said, crossing his arms. "What business do you have in this station?" Naomi remained perfectly still, her expression unreadable. I'm here on official matters. I need to access. I don't care what you think you need. Callaway interrupted, his smirk widening. Civilians don't just walk in here like they own the place. The tension in the room shifted. Several officers had stopped what they were doing, their eyes flicking between Naomi and Callaway. Some looked amused, others wary. Naomi's fingers itched to pull out her badge, to shut him up with a single flash of authority. But she stopped herself. She wanted to see how deep this rot went. I have every right to be here, she said simply. Callaway chuckled. Yeah? And who the hell are you? Naomi didn't flinch. Someone you don't want to make an enemy of. That wiped the smirk off his face for just a second before it returned, meaner this time. I don't have time for this. Either you tell me what you're doing here, or I'll have you escorted out. She met his stare, unblinking. Try it. The challenge hung in the air. Callaway grabbed her wrist. Gasps rippled through the room. A few officers exchanged glances, but no one stepped in. I don't think you understand how things work around here, Callaway said, tightening his grip. Naomi barely had time to react before he yanked his taser from his belt and fired. Pain exploded through her body as thousands of volts coursed through her, her muscles locking up as she collapsed to the floor. The room went dead silent. Naomi lay there, her body trembling from the aftershocks, her breath shallow. Callaway loomed over her, still holding the taser, a satisfied sneer curling his lips. I told you not to push me, he said, his voice low and smug. A few officers turned away. Others shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke up. Naomi's breath came in short bursts as she forced herself to focus, to push past the pain. She had seen men like him before, cowards who mistook power for strength. What Callaway didn't know was that he had just made the worst mistake of his career. Pain still crackled through Naomi's muscles, but she refused to stay down. Gritting her teeth, she focused on her breathing, forcing her body to comply. Every nerve screamed, but she wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her weak. The station remained eerily silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, casting a harsh glow over the tense scene. Officers stared, some frozen in shock, others looking away, unwilling to involve themselves. Callaway stood over her, taser still in his grip, his expression smug. He thought he had won. Naomi pressed her hands to the cold tile floor and slowly, deliberately, began to push herself up. Her arms trembled, but she refused to let them give out. You just made the biggest mistake of your life, she rasped, her voice rough but unwavering. Callaway let out a short laugh, crossing his arms. Oh, yeah? And who the hell do you think you are? Naomi locked eyes with him, a slow, knowing smirk creeping onto her lips despite the lingering pain. Without breaking eye contact, she reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a badge, one he had clearly never bothered to ask for. She held it up, letting the gold emblem gleam under the lights. Silence. Complete suffocating silence. Several officers inhaled sharply. A few took a visible step back. Reality had just slapped them all in the face. Naomi took her time standing up now, dusting off her blazer as if nothing had happened. She fixed Callaway with an icy stare before speaking. Naomi Carter, she said evenly. Your new chief of police. The color drained from Callaway's face. Murmurs rippled through the room. The officers who had once looked entertained now seemed uneasy. A few exchanged glances, as if trying to decide how to react. Naomi took a slow step toward Callaway, who instinctively stepped back. And you, she said, her voice cool and measured, just assaulted your superior officer in front of a room full of witnesses. For the first time since he had approached her, Callaway was speechless. The room remained frozen in silence. The officers who had been watching, some entertained, some indifferent, now stood motionless, eyes darting between Naomi and Callaway. Naomi adjusted her blazer, squared her shoulders, and let the weight of her words settle over the room. Callaway, once so smug and confident, looked as if the ground had been ripped out from under him. "Is there anything you'd like to say, Officer Callaway?" Naomi asked, her voice smooth, composed. For the first time, he had no smart comeback, no arrogance left in his stance. Instead, his face twisted into something between shock and barely contained rage. "This is some kind of joke," he muttered, shaking his head as if he could erase what had just happened. "You think you can walk in here and just take over?" Naomi took a step forward, her heels clicking against the tile, the sound sharp and deliberate. "I don't think, Callaway," she said. I know." His jaw tightened. "You don't belong here." Naomi tilted her head, studying him. "And yet, I'm standing right here as your boss. Imagine that." A murmur spread through the officers. Some looked away. Others watched intently, as if realizing for the first time that the game had changed. Callaway's fists clenched at his sides. "You don't know how things work around here." Naomi gave a humorless chuckle. "Oh, I know exactly how things work. That's why I'm here, to fix it." She turned to the young officer at the front desk. "Call Internal Affairs," she instructed, her voice crisp. "I want a full investigation into today's events. Now." The young officer hesitated for only a second, then nodded and reached for the phone. Callaway's face flushed red. "You can't do this," he barked. Naomi raised an eyebrow. "I just did." His breathing grew heavier, his fury barely contained. "You have no idea who you're messing with." Naomi's expression didn't change. "Neither do you." Another officer, an older man with a weary face, finally spoke up from the side. "Chief Carter." He hesitated, as if unsure whether to speak or stay silent. Naomi looked at him, waiting. "There have been complaints about Callaway before, but they never made it past the higher-ups." Naomi's gaze flicked back to Callaway, whose eyes darkened. "Is that so?" she mused. "Well, looks like we'll be doing some digging then." Callaway took an involuntary step back, his confidence unraveling as reality set in. Naomi turned to the rooms, scanning the faces around her. "If any of you have something to say," she announced, "now would be a very good time." The room remained eerily silent, but Naomi could feel it. The shift, the fear, and the realization that things were about to change. The tension in the room was suffocating. Callaway stood stiffly, his face still flushed with anger. But now there was something else beneath the surface: fear. The power he had once wielded so effortlessly was slipping from his grasp. Naomi turned to the young officer at the front desk, who was still holding the phone. "Did you make the call?" she asked. The officer hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Internal Affairs is sending someone over." Callaway let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "You really think you can dig up dirt on me?" he sneered. "You won't find anything. I've been here over a decade, and I've never been disciplined. Not once." Naomi's lips curled into a knowing smirk. "That's what concerns me, Callaway. A cop with your reputation and not a single mark on your record. Either you're the cleanest officer in this department, or someone's been covering for you." Callaway's eyes flickered. A brief moment of hesitation. She had hit a nerve. Naomi turned toward a group of officers standing near the back of the room. Some looked uncomfortable, while others averted their gazes entirely. "How many of you have seen Officer Callaway abuse his power?" she asked, her voice steady. No one spoke. but the silence was an answer in itself. Then, from the corner of the room, a voice broke through. "I've—" All heads turned toward Officer Daniels, a younger cop who had been sitting quietly, clearly debating whether or not to speak. His face was tense, but his eyes held something Callaway lacked, a sense of conscience. Callaway's head snapped toward him. "Watch it, Daniels," he growled. Naomi stepped between them, blocking Callaway's view. "No, Officer Callaway," she said, her tone cold and unwavering. "You watch it." She turned back to Daniels. "Go on," she urged. Daniels swallowed hard, then nodded. "I've seen him rough up suspects, threaten people who questioned him. Hell, I've seen him falsify reports." The murmurs around the room grew louder. The wall of silence was breaking. Naomi crossed her arms. That's all I needed to hear. Callaway's career wasn't just in danger anymore. It was over. The room felt like it was holding its breath. Officers exchanged glances, some uneasy, some relieved. Callaway's arrogance had cracked. And now, for the first time, he was the one on the defensive. Naomi stood firm, arms crossed, watching him with the patience of someone who knew the inevitable was coming. "You're done, Callaway," she said simply. His nostrils flared. "You think you can just waltz in here and take everything from me?" Naomi didn't blink. "No, Callaway. You took it from yourself." The door to the station swung open, and two men in suits walked in. Internal affairs officers. Their presence shifted the air in the room even further, making it oppressively heavy. One of them, a no-nonsense-looking man with graying hair, approached Callaway directly. "Ryan Callaway," he said, his tone clipped. "Effective immediately. You are placed on administrative leave, pending an investigation into multiple allegations of misconduct, including excessive force, falsifying reports, and abuse of power." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Some officers stared at their desks, pretending they weren't witnessing this. Others watched with wide eyes, as if they couldn't believe it was actually happening. Callaway let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "You can't be serious. This is all because of her?" He gestured aggressively at Naomi. The IA officer didn't flinch. "This is because of you." Callaway turned, looking for allies, but the faces around him were either blank or unreadable. The same men who once laughed at his jokes now refused to meet his gaze. For the first time, he was alone. "Hand over your badge and weapon," the IA officer instructed. Callaway didn't move, his hands clenched into fists. Naomi stepped forward, her voice calm but unshakable. "You heard him, Callaway. Badge, gun, now." His breathing was ragged now, his control slipping. "This isn't over," he growled. Naomi smirked. "Oh, it is. You just haven't accepted it yet." Slowly, reluctantly, Callaway reached up and unpinned his badge. His fingers trembled as he placed it on the desk. Then, with a sharp click, he unholstered his gun and set it down beside the badge. The IA officers stepped closer. "Let's go," one of them said. Callaway turned toward Naomi, his eyes filled with pure hatred. "You think you've won?" Naomi didn't flinch. "I don't think," she said. "I know." With that, the officers led Callaway out. And just like that, the most corrupt officer in Brookhaven PD was finally powerless. The sound of Callaway's footsteps fading down the hall left an eerie silence in the station. No one spoke. The same officers who once laughed with him now sat still, unsure of what came next. Naomi stood in the center of the room, arms crossed, letting the weight of the moment settle. "For years," she began, her voice calm but firm, "this department has operated under the assumption that men like Callaway were untouchable, that no matter what they did, no one would hold them accountable. Her gaze swept across the room, meeting the eyes of every officer who dared to look up. That ends today. A few officers shifted uncomfortably. Others nodded slightly, as if finally acknowledging what they had known all along. From the back of the room, Officer Daniels hesitated before stepping forward. "Chief Carter," he said, clearing his throat. "I know I should have spoken up sooner. I was scared, but—" Naomi raised a hand, stopping him. "Fear is what allowed this to happen for so long," she said. "What matters is what you do now. The only question that remains is whether you're here to serve this community or to serve yourselves." A few more officers nodded. A quiet ripple of realization passed through the room. A shift, small but undeniable. Naomi turned on her heel, heading toward her office, but before stepping inside, she glanced over her shoulder. "If you're here to do the job right, you have nothing to fear," she said. "But if you're not, know that I'm watching." As she closed the door behind her, Brookhaven PD no longer felt like the same place. It was finally changing. The story of Naomi Carter is more than just a tale of power and justice. It is a reminder of the importance of accountability, courage, and standing up against corruption. In our daily lives, we may not face the same level of institutional injustice, but we all encounter moments where we must decide whether to stay silent or speak up. One of the key lessons from this story is that power without accountability leads to corruption. Whether in workplaces, schools, or communities, unchecked authority allows wrongdoing to persist. If we ignore unethical behavior, we become complicit in its continuation. Another crucial takeaway is that change starts with one person willing to challenge the system. Naomi knew she would face resistance, yet she refused to back down. Her strength reminds us that integrity and persistence matter, even when the odds are stacked against us. In everyday life, we should ask ourselves, are we speaking up when we see injustice? Are we holding those in power accountable? Are we leading with integrity, even when it's difficult? True change begins when we stop looking away and start taking action, no matter how small. Today's story isn't just about justice. It's about the courage to challenge a broken system. Naomi Carter refused to stay silent, even when faced with corruption, abuse of power, and resistance from those who wanted to maintain the status quo. But, in real life, standing up against wrongdoing is never easy. It comes with risks and consequences. If you were in Naomi's shoes, what would you do? Would you fight back and expose the truth, no matter the cost? 1. Or would you stay quiet to avoid conflict and protect yourself? 2. Drop 1 or 2 in the comments below and tell us why. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you enjoyed this story and want more like it, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Police car on fire.